Hello there. Once again, this is Ramirez from Tidewater Renaissance Fighting Arts, and today we're going to talk about Montante. I want to start with thanking a few people. There is another video series called The Vulgar Skill, and they were very instrumental in my exposure to Godinho and the first rules of Godinho. Also, Ton Puey is from Spain. He also does a wonderful video series on the Montante. And I said, well, if these are there, why am I here talking about it? Well, unfortunately, the Vulgar Skill thus far has not covered a lot of the rules, and I hope to cover more of them over the course of this year to get through all of the rules. Also, like I said, I'll be explaining this from a left-handed perspective, so you'll have the advantage, if you are left-handed, of learning it from someone else who's left-handed. One of the key guides I'll be using, I'm going to be going over Godinho's rules for Montante, and I would strongly recommend that you get a copy of Iberian Swordplay. This is by Tim Rivera. He is done a wonderful translation without putting too much of his own spin on things, and that's really great. The book's not terribly expensive, but there's something you should know, and this should be for anyone who is going by manuals. A lot of times, any good manual, a historical manual, what they will do is they will teach you several weapons. So if you look at Meyer, if you look at Fiore, you'll see that the lessons they explain in the beginning help you with the weapons at the end of the book. So it's very important, if you do get this book, that you start reading at the beginning and then kind of work your way through. If you do that, you will learn the terminology, the basic cuts that maybe they don't explain explicitly in the more advanced or the further chapters in the book, because they kind of presume you know it from the beginning. When I teach you about these rules, I will explain that you might not have read all that. So I'm going to assume you know nothing as far as what you're trying to get out of it, and that we can kind of work together. Being left-handed, I'm going to teach Montante so that even if you're right-handed, you could learn it, because I'm going to change a few things or a few critical definitions that would mean something if you're right-handed versus left-handed, because you have to transpose it. And so one of the first things is a Tahoe, is a cut. And there is a Tahoe and a reverse, or a reverse. And when you do these cuts, when I say a Tahoe, I'm going to say it's coming from your dominant hand or your dominant hand side to your non-dominant hand side. So it doesn't matter if you're left-handed or right-handed. A Tahoe represents, if I'm left-handed, if I'm cutting from the left to the right, that's a Tahoe. If I'm coming from my non-dominant hand and I'm going across, that's a reverse. And one of the things that's kind of important to know is that Tahoes are not explicitly stated as like an Oberhau, an Unterhau, a Mitterhau. They aren't defined by high or low. They're literally defined left to right or right to left. So you could be cutting straight across, that's still a Tahoe. You can be cutting low, that's still a Tahoe. You can be cutting up, that's still a Tahoe. You can be cutting on any diagonals. It's really about the direction. So some of the rules you might be used to from longsword are a little different in Godinho's approach to sword work. And so for me, I will still say Tahoe and reverse, but understand that instead of it meaning necessarily right to left, it means dominant hand to non-dominant hand side. I think that if you think of it that way, it'll be a little easier. You'll see in Rule 2, which I actually have already recorded, I tried to switch it and tried to be right-handed, and it just was not working for me, so I kind of cut it out, but you will see that in the video. But really, if we think of it that way, it'll be a little easier for both someone who's left-handed, someone who's right-handed to be able to do these techniques. Speaking of that, if you are, Godinho is very particular about the idea of thrusting. It's one of the critical things that he's going to mention in the different rules that we will learn over the course of this series. And doing what he calls a nails up or a nails down thrust, which means that when you're holding the sword, so if I'm left-handed, a nails down means I'm holding it, I'm turning it with my nails down. This will be the type of thrust you will do on your dominant side. If you're doing a nails up thrust, which means your hand is turned and your fingernails are facing up, that will always be a thrust to your non-dominant side. So whenever he talks about nails up, nails down, what you want to think of is this the dominant side, the side that I'm holding the weapon on, or is this my non-dominant side, the side that I'm not holding the weapon on? So once again, nails down will be the dominant side, nails up will be your non-dominant side. So kind of understanding that will be very helpful to you. Now you'll notice I don't have a Montante on me because Rule 1 really doesn't deal with an actual cut. It's more like rules. And one of the important rules that, as you look at Godinho, he certainly is a much more preferential to thrusts. And he kind of specifies that. He also specifies, if you look at a lot of videos, he wasn't alive now, but now that we're here, if you watch people doing Montante videos, I know I'm a little blurry on camera, I'm trying to fix that. But if you're watching videos, a lot of times for Montante, people do elaborate flourishes. And I get it, that's really cool. Godinho is very much against this idea, and he recounts a story about someone being beaten, them wielding a Montante with someone else wielding a dagger. And really it was because the person was overly flashy and screwed up. And it really is very easy to do that. The weapon is so large that if it hits the ground, your entire flourish is screwed. If you mistime something, or someone just really times something right, if you're doing something elaborate, you may not get your attack in on time. So he very much discourages the idea of really, really fancy flourishes that other masters have talked about, have taught, and you might, as a person who wants to study Montante, say, that's really cool, I want to do that. But in fighting, you really shouldn't be doing that. You should be only doing cuts once you're more or less engaged, and that's a part of Rule 1. Rule 1 also kind of specifies that at night, or really at any point, you don't want to have your Montante sheathed. And I know there have been other channels that have talked about other great swords and saying, no, they weren't sheathed to begin with. Well, apparently in 1599, when he wrote this book, people had them sheathed because he explicitly states they should not be sheathed, especially if you're going out at night. Because ultimately, you're going to not be able to take that off in any significant amount of time. And you can't tell someone who is attacking you that, oh, wait a second, wait for me to unsheath this, because if it's at night, if there's a gambling debt, if you're walking or escorting a person of importance, they're not going to give you any second. As a matter of fact, they're going to count on the fact of being able to ambush you. So he says, don't bother having it out there. He also says, don't wear hats or leave anything that you could potentially leave behind. And he's talking about that in the idea that if you get into a illegal street fight, that you don't want to leave any evidence behind. You'll notice that when I generally teach in the videos, I will be wearing my flat cap, which once again, it doesn't really affect the Montante because it's very close to my head. I do have, when I do some other reenactments, I have this huge leather hat, brimmed hat. And you don't want to wear a hat like that because obviously you can't do the techniques. You can't even rest the sword on your shoulder because it'll get in the way. Speaking of holding the montante, he recommends that you have it on your non-dominant shoulder being held by your non-dominant hand. So in my case, I would put it in my right hand and I would lean it over my shoulder pointing back. And there's a very simple reason for this. And that's one of the things I want to get into is why should we do certain things? Why are these rules in place? And part of the reason to do that is if I want to choose a hand to get tired carrying this, then I want it to be my non-dominant hand. I don't want to have it in my dominant hand, let that arm really get tired over whatever kind of walk to going wherever I'm going, and just letting that hand get tired out when I'm going to need it. So he suggests, once again, non-dominant hand, non-dominant shoulder. You can always, when you swing it forward, just switch your grip and you're ready to go. So I think there's a lot of practicality in what he is saying. Once again, like avoiding flourishes, making sure it's unsheathed at night or quite frankly in the day as well. Also carrying it with your non-dominant hand over your non-dominant shoulder. Not really leaning it back, but just keeping it at rest, angled over. And once again, there is a practicality to that. For me personally, the practicality is if you balance the sword, so if you have it so your parry hocking are kind of here, I know I'm not standing up, but you're holding it a little bit lower. What you're going to do is you're going to center the balance of mass directly over your bones. And why is that important? Things are light when you have them directly over your body. So when you're carrying weight that way, it's just kind of an efficient way of doing it. If you lean it too far back, then you're holding it up like this, you have weight going across your trapezius. It's just easier to have it that way, balanced directly over. One of the reasons that I know this as a person, you might say, well, how the hell do you know that? And the answer is, when I'm not teaching HEMA, when I'm not taking lessons in HEMA, I'm a professional ballroom dancer, and I've also done lifts where I lift people. And one of the first rules they tell you there is, if you're going to lift a person up, put them over your own body. Your own skeletal structure will hold. The further you hold someone away, the harder it is to keep that weight steady and easy. So the same principle, even though he wasn't thinking that way, is that if I hold it that way, it's an easier way to carry it. It's an easier way to keep that weight balanced over my body, where I can take that weight with negligible tiredness. So those were the major points in Rule 1. Rule 1 really wasn't... Oh, there is one other thing that I should mention about Rule 1, which is there are a series of rules that are meant to teach you both how to use, how to swing the sword, how to thrust with the sword. And he tells you, use the right rule for the right situation. So obviously there is a rule for a narrow street. You don't want to use that if there are people all around you, because you're pretty much tacking forward and back. If you have a little more space, go ahead, take advantage of the cuts. That'll be Rule 2. But once again, that won't help you if you're surrounded or if you're trying to protect someone. If someone's behind you, you would not want to use either Rule 2 or Rule 3, because ultimately you'd be hitting that person as well, and that would be bad. So we wait further on down the road, we'll get rules for those situations. And lastly, in Rule 1, is that if you're actually fighting against someone else who has a montante, basically throw all the rules out, start with the thrusts, engage in cuts once you're really in range. What I believe, what Godinho is trying to avoid, is that you bring this huge weapon up here and someone basically in Flug goes bleh, and you're dead. So he wanted to really kind of avoid that. So that's also in the rules. And he says when you're fighting against someone else with a montante, you know, the rules that we have are meant to protect you from multiple opponents. So you're doing actions that would help you in that situation. But if it's one-on-one, there's no reason to be stabbing or cutting at your opponent's invisible friends. You really want to focus on them. So some of these rules are really not going to apply. And that's it for rule 1 of the Montante. If you do stick around for the series, you will see me at the club, and I will be demonstrating some of those other techniques. So we'll start those with rule 2 in our next video. Thank you very much. Have a good day.